Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play The Guardian Legend. In the last part, we went through areas 5 and 6, and now we're in area 7, which is, pretty fleshy looking, in a way that I don't find appealing to look at. And very early on here, we have ourselves our first mini-boss in the area against, once again, another blob. This was already kind of an easy fight early on, given that it's the first mini-boss you fight overall, barring, I guess, technically the one in Corridor 0. At this point with your upgraded arsenal, though, it doesn't really stand a chance. I think the later variants of this boss fight do spawn in more of the slime enemies when it teleports away, but because they die so quickly, it really shouldn't cause much of a threat. If anything, their movement speed makes them harder to hit than the main boss fight. For doing that, we get ourselves another grenade, which upgrades our grenade up to level 3. That makes it go from costing 5 per shot at level 2 to 20 per shot at level 3. And it increases its damage per hit to 48, which I think technically makes it the strongest individual weapon in the game. It's just that it won't hit as many times as, say, a fireball clipping through an enemy's hitbox over and over again, or things like that. The size of the explosion is increased even further. I think it can also destroy basically any projectile or main enemy in one shot. Just a matter of, that's a lot of chip you're using at once, technically. Albeit at this point, as you may have noticed, our chip count is reaching over 1,000 plus. Given that it maxes out at 4,000, that 20 per shot doesn't matter nearly as much by endgame as it did early on. That's kind of the funny thing about this game, in that in a lot of regards, while bosses do a lot of damage in the latter half of it, the sub-weapons they give you power up at such a rate relative to the amount of chip you get that they just become effectively your main weapons in a lot of regard, as we've even seen already, even with how I used the enemy eraser a lot last time, and how we're gonna see me especially start using it a lot more moving forward. Also worth noting, I think there is a max amount of enemy erasers you can carry, but frankly it doesn't matter because they show up so regularly that anything you use will probably get replenished pretty quickly. I think you get 20 enemy erasers per pickup of them too, so hey, like, if you're mash firing that, you're likely to get one every, like, minute or so you'll probably keep up a good stock. Also, this is an example of what I was talking about earlier in the LP, where there's so much happening on screen that the sprite flickering starts to rival that of the worst cases of it in Mega Man, Classic at least. Enemy erasers can also help alleviate that, though something I'm not sure about to this day is if sometimes the game will actively cause enemies to not spawn right if you don't take care of them quickly enough. And in that regard, maybe sometimes using the enemy eraser can cause enemies to spawn in more quickly or even despawn faster in some cases. But hey, it gets my score up, it gets items to spawn in, that's what matters, because the more score I have, the more health I have. Now, something worth noting, I was actually doing a little more research in between parts, and I actively found an old Game Facts thread that talks a lot about the behind-the-scenes mechanics of the game in terms of, like, pure numbers when it comes to, like, health ups and defense ups and all that, and how much they actually affect damage in that regard by the_Admiral on Game Facts. And I think starting next corridor after the upcoming boss, we're gonna start talking about that, because the numbers behind it are kind of interesting. For right now, though, the boss fight of Corridor 17 is a bunch of eyes. The eyes fire eyeballs at you that slightly track onto you. Enemy erasers can come in handy for that. And the fireball can take care of the smaller cannons next to them as well. In some regards, this is a revisit to the Corridor 0 boss fight. As long as you're being good about firing into them pretty constantly, they'll die pretty quickly. They do have a lot of health, but the fireball will melt through that relatively quickly. In some regards, it's a much easier boss fight than a lot of the other ones. Even if you took this on earlier on in the game somehow, you wouldn't be in that much danger. Worth noting though, this is actually a fight where you can very easily see something happen occasionally where if you destroy smaller projectiles on top of the same tile, you can actually overwrite item boxes you haven't picked up yet. And in that case, you might accidentally lose out on some health in case you're low, so keep that in mind. So for clearing Corridor 17, we're going to get ourselves a Saber Laser upgrade, which will, I believe, upgrade it all the way up to level 3, and now costs 30 chips per second, but it now does a massive 8 times your current gun power. With the amount of chips we have now, and even by endgame, that 30 chip per second is pretty steep, but honestly, it's pretty good, not even as an offensive weapon, it's pretty good as a defensive option for taking care of items that might try to hit you along the way. Immediately after that, though, we got ourselves another level 3 item upgrade. We got ourselves the level 3 repeller. That makes it jump from 10 chips per shot to 30 per shot, and from 7 damage up to 10. The bullet is now much larger, and the speed that it rotates while moving increases as well. But also, its travel speed decreases, so it's actively better as a defensive and offensive option because of that overall Honestly, it's better as a defensive option at that point, I would argue, because of the screen clearance it'll have for destroying projectiles. It's just a matter if you prefer to have that on screen or something else. And there we got ourselves another shield upgrade, so our defense is even higher. Try and enter the room in the corridor several times. Only then will Seal 7 be removed, so in order to open up Corridor 7, you gotta enter and exit the room several times effectively. So, this next room here is a shop, and I'd say it's the most useless shop in the game. Don't go for hearts, like I said before, you get those commonly enough in enemy drops anyway. The wave attack would be an upgrade, but there's a free one for that in a later area anyway, so you don't exactly need it. And the rapid fire upgrade, depending on your choices with shops or what you found in level design already, you're probably already maxed. I wasn't sure if I was maxed, so I grabbed it anyway, but honestly, I would just recommend saving your chips and just not spending any there whatsoever. That there shield item puts our defense up to level 7, which is the maximum level. We will now take the minimum of damage from anything, which makes the amount of damage we still take at times kind of ridiculous in retrospect. I have a feeling I may have said the defense upgrade we got in like Area 6 that also increased our movement speed was the second highest level. I think if I said that, if that may have also been an outtake now I think about it, that was likely because you get the 6th and 7th upgrades that quickly together. So here's Corridor 7. You need to just enter and exit the room over and over again until it opens. I think it's a set amount, like maybe 5 times, but frankly I never counted because it happens eventually. It does happen when you actively exit the room though. So the next time you enter and exit, it will stay open that time. And thus, time for plot Corridor 7. So for right now, let's talk about the mechanics of the gun behind the scenes as found by the Admiral on GameFAQs, as well as our defense. At base, your gun does 1 damage per hit. How much damage that does over time depends on the rapid fire, of course, on top of individual enemy invincibility frames, which I think basic enemies have very few, whereas bosses have more. When you get the first gun upgrade, that damage is doubled to 2 per hit, which is a nice doubling. At level 3, it's 3 per hit, which, hey, that's still a notable increase. And the final gun upgrade, when we get that, will increase it from 3 damage to 5, which is a lesser increase each time, but still worth getting. What really matters is your rapid fire, as you get the rapid fire upgrades. Now, the Admiral themselves effectively says they're not sure if the data that's listed here is a number of frames or if it's units that are defined elsewhere in the code, but ultimately, at level 0, there is a delay of 12 between your shots. At level 1, it's a delay of 5. Level 2, 4. Level 3, 3. Level 4, 2. And level 5, there's 1 delay between each shot, which is especially useful if you get straight up in front of an enemy, because that means your damage just piles up them faster and faster and faster. With that said, you still have to keep in mind on-screen bullet limitations. For instance, they note when you have no sub-weapon selected, you can have up to 4 bullets on screen at a time. If the area blaster, backfire, or cutter laser are in use, you can only have 2 bullets on screen. But if any of the other special weapons are selected or even actively in use, you can only have 3 bullets on screen. So technically the best way to do damage with your main blaster is to have no sub-weapon selected at all. Also, the boss of Corridor 7 is the same thing as the boss of Corridor 17. I guess technically it's a little harder because I think they spawn in more extra enemies like the centipedes there and the mushroom enemies. But anything you're doing to damage the eyes will take them out effectively in 1 or 2 shots anyway, so they don't get much of a chance to be a threat. Honestly, Area 7 here on the whole probably has some of the easiest bosses in the game relative to the point you fight them at. Especially considering the amount of damage other bosses at this point in the game can do. Notably, for beating this boss, you're going to get a cutter laser upgrade, putting that up to level 3 if you grab the other 2 thus far, which makes that now cost 35 chips per second, but it'll do 8 times your current gun power. And since that actively reaches out to your left and right, again, a pretty good defensive option to erase enemy bullets or even enemies along the way. The chip draining could be annoying in some cases, but at the same time, with how much damage you'll be doing and how frequently energy tanks or blue or red orbs that restore chips spawn anyway when you're killing a lot of enemies, it can be pretty manageable on the whole, honestly. And thus, it's time for us to leave Area 7 and make our way towards Area 8, though there is a brief detour we want to hit up along the way. Earlier in the LP, there was a door I showed off just to my south that actively had a hint for Area 6's main corridor. If we head to a room just south of that, we can also find the hint for Area 8's main corridor. To remove seal number 8, set your weapon to no use, and fire. So effectively, to open up Corridor 8, select no sub-weapon, and then press the sub-weapon button. which is probably actually why they grouped that up with the Area 6 hint, because it's effectively the same technique, just whether or not you're using a sub-weapon at all, really. Admittedly, actually, on that note as well, Area 8 has another similarity to Area 6 and Area 1 in that regard. Corridor 8's right at the start, but there's a notable upgrade I want to get later in the area first, so we're going to do that last. So let's go back to talking about the Admiral's notes, and specifically the defense levels in the game. At your base defense level, you take 100% damage from everything, which is why some of the early game bosses even can be so relatively punishing for the amount of health you have, because you're taking the full brunt of their attacks. At the first defense upgrade, that gets halved down to 50% damage, which, hey, that's already really good. At the second defense upgrade, you start taking 1/3 damage. At level 4, you take quarter damage. At level 5, you take 20% damage. At level 6, you take 17% damage. And at level 7, you take 14 damage, which is a really notable upgrade. But at the same time, with how quickly you take hits in this game because of the amount of invincibility frames you yourself have, bosses still get relatively punishing. In fact, that red urchin we just fought, I'd say is one of the hardest mini-bosses in the game because of how fast it tracks onto you because of that. With that said, I do find Area 8 a little funny. Some of the enemies in here are just straight-up mini-bosses, which means they're really throwing everything at you nowadays. But at the same time, you can throw everything you have at them, so it's not like they really get a chance to be super threatening. Guardian Legend does ultimately have, I think, a pretty satisfying difficulty curve. There's really only a few bosses towards endgame that I'd say are really, I don't want to say horse shit with the amount they throw at you, but definitely overwhelming, I guess is the way I will phrase that. Worth noting as well, and I'm mainly bringing this up just to showcase the ridiculousness that is the Optimon's damage. The Admiral also has a table noting the actual HP of every boss fight, their contact damage, and any projectiles they have in terms of their damage. Let's talk about the early things. So, for instance, Fleepa, the first boss fight. 80 damage, contact does 8 damage, projectiles do 4 damage. Manageable for the amount of early game health. The Green Optimon, the boss at the end of Area 1, albeit it's technically the end of Corridor 11, which is optional, but you're gonna probably do it in order, has 160 health, contact damage is 48, projectile 1, which is the seaweed, does 48 damage. That is a ridiculous spike. But they also note, actually, the actual invulnerability timer, so let's actually note this. Apparently, when your normal shots hit a boss, they cause an explosion, which actually does take up a sprite slot, but that still technically takes up one of your on-screen shots. So technically, even though you have 4 on-screen shots at a time, with no sub-weapon selected, that extra slot's probably going to be taken up by an explosion anyway. With that said, special weapons, so your sub-weapons, damage for them is only checked every 8th frame. And during the other 7 frames, anything you're doing is technically not considered as doing damage. That includes your main bullet shots, the sub-weapons, and even technically yourself. And what that means is, if you have a sub-weapon that's constantly on the boss, like the ones that home in on the bosses or the fireball as it clips through a larger hitbox, you can use that to your advantage to go straight through a boss's hitbox and take less damage than if you didn't have a sub-weapon out. And that might help you eke out of some tougher situations in some of the endgame boss fights, but that definitely is a high-risk play. Speaking of health, I'll talk more about the specifics in a few moments. But the reason I actually found this particular information from the Admiral was because I was actually looking for how many points it takes to get every single health increase in the game, just to note that you really shouldn't grind for it because it takes too long. The Admiral does list that, as well as what technically health hearts in the bottom left actually mean in terms of behind-the-scenes code, and I'll note that after the upcoming boss fight. Speaking of the upcoming boss fight, it's a rough one. The boss of Corridor 18 is known as a Grim Grin. It's a giant face that flies in what I guess I could call a variation of a figure 8, but it's more like a figure X, where it'll loop around in a circle in one half of an X, start doing another loop, and then move in the opposite part of an X. I don't really know what to call that otherwise. Every single one of the Grim Grin's eyes fire out projectiles, while the main mouth fires out eyes that home into you. It moves pretty quickly, and the amount of projectiles on screen means you can drain, your health can get drained pretty quickly. But also with its apparently 1100 health, you got a lot of damage to get through yourself. Thankfully, the further you get into the fight against this particular boss type, it does get easier and easier because you take out the extra eyes that throw more projectiles at you. So by the end of a given fight against one of these, it's not a lot to write home about. If anything, it has less projectiles than even the early area bosses like Fleepa. But still, keep your eye out and watch out for your health. If anything in that regard, the more projectiles you take out, yes, there's less on-screen to dodge, but also that means there's less on-screen that can give you health pickups or energy tanks to restore your sub-weapons. So, one of those kind of liquid difficulty kind of deals, so to speak. In the meanwhile, though, I did actually miss talking about a weapon upgrade during talking about all that technical information. Along the way, we got ourselves the second hyper laser upgrade, which maxes that thing out. It now costs 30 chips per shot. Its damage technically doesn't decrease, but because of the increase of the size of the lasers and how long they're on screen, it does technically do more damage per shot than the prior level did. Not too bad as an offensive and defensive option here in the shoot-'em-up stages, but ultimately I do prefer other weapons, including the reason we ended up going for Corridor 18 before we did Corridor 8, as this is I think the only time in the game where the plot corridor is earlier in the stage than the optional corridor, but I do it first. Because for doing this particular corridor, we get the second Fireball upgrade. When the Fireball maxes out at level 3, it costs 30 per shot, but it does 32 damage, and its speed increases, so you get more shots of it per second. The level 3 Fireball is my favorite sub-weapon for most of the game. You have to wait a lot of the game to get it, yes, but for what's remaining, it's what I like to use the most. There are cases where, say, the grenade will be more useful overall, because you can stay off to the side from enemies in some cases for all using it, but I still adore the level 3 Fireball. So while we're on our way into and start doing Corridor 8 itself, let's talk about the health mechanics according to the Admiral. So, the main reason I did this was to figure out the points needed for every single health upgrade in the game and why I should know it's really not worth grinding out the points for every health upgrade. Your first health bonus from points is at 30,000 points, which you get pretty quickly. The next one's at 100,000. The next is at 500,000. The next one's at 1 million, which we still haven't reached, and I think we get well in this next corridor. After that, you get a health upgrade every 1 million points, which maxes out at 9 million then, according to how big the score counter is in terms of digits, though. To demonstrate how much grinding that would take, we finished this LP out at about 2.1 million points. Yes, theoretically that could have been higher because there are a lot of times I ignored a lot of enemies along the way. On top of that, I think, again, you do technically get more points for taking out an enemy without using the enemy erasers. But that still is about, at most, probably 6.5 million I probably would have had to grind out. And that takes a while. Even if you use, like, the spiders that show up as early as, I think, like, Area 2 or 3 to do that, that still was an absurdly long grind that just isn't worth it in my eyes. But on that note, let's also note how health itself is actually dictated behind the scenes. We have 19 hearts in the bottom left. Every heart itself actually stands for a unit of 8 HP, so at 19 hearts, we actually have 152 health total. We started the game at 8 hearts, which means 64 health, which is pretty notable on the whole, but when you put that against the first Optimon's 48 damage, that is 3/4 your HP gone in a single shot if you get hit by that thing, which is why that's such a weird difficulty spike compared to the rest of the game. Worth noting, by the way, upcoming boss of Corridor 8 is a red Grim with about 1,600 health or so. Same strategies apply. Fireball, extraordinarily good here, especially now that it's level 3. Something actually I don't think I've noted yet. They actually do show you how many shots of a particular weapon you have on the bottom right of the screen at all times, relative to your current maximum chip count. Which, honestly, I appreciate that, because if I had to keep track of how much chip usage I was doing per second with a singular weapon without showing my total shot count, that would be kind of aggravating. So what's kind of complicated about your health is that, visually, it apparently stops tracking at 24 hearts, so 192 health. But due to the point bonus hearts, your health does go up beyond that to 32 hearts, so 255 HP. That is a very noticeable increase, but it really just isn't worth grinding for, because that would probably over double the game's length, just grinding enemies for that. Though there is a way that's technically easier to do that, but you don't technically unlock that until you've beaten the game. Because we've seen the game's password system, it's 32 characters long. There is a specialty password you get upon beating the game that plays the game in a certain way, and we'll talk about probably more in depth next time. And it is actually easier to get max score there than it is during the main game. In the meanwhile, though, let's talk about what we're going to get for clearing this particular boss. For one thing, we're going to get the next key, which is the triangle key. But the weapon upgrade we get from this particular boss is another bullet shield upgrade, which will max that out at level 3. It'll now cost 30 chips per second, and its damage doesn't actively increase still. It's still whatever your current gun power is. But the orbs rotating around you increase in size to the point where it is now an incredible defensive option, especially in very crowded fights like things like Grim Grins, or specific things we'll see towards endgame. Would I recommend using it over certain offensive options? Depends on the situation, honestly. I'd still say level 3 Fireball and level 3 Grenade are probably still going to be better to make things go faster overall, on top of how big their area of effects are. They'll probably do just as much defensively as the Shield Bullet, but it is still also really good for just going through the standard shoot 'em up stage part of the shoot 'em up stages, as it'll protect you from a lot of the smaller enemies that rely on trying to do contact damage on you, so your mileage may vary on that. So now that we've grabbed that, we're now free to go to Area 9. Now, both Areas 9 and 10 are on the northern half of the map. They are the area fully north of us and northwest of us in specific. But before I head over them in specific, I do want to max out my chip counter. If you haven't made this a very good habit yet, you really should, with the amount of chips we have at this point. On top of how much weapons now cost, checking in at this particular screen every single area is effectively a necessity. On top of the fact, it's not a bad way to heal overall. Although I guess at that note, I probably should note how much every single healing item heals you for. Hearts heal you for 40 HP, so about 5 full hearts. Red chips are 16 HP plus 500 chips. Blue chips are 2 health plus 20 chips. Red and blue landers max out your HP as well as give you the next health or chip level. Special weapon upgrades also technically heal you for 16 health total, so 2 heart points. Whereas energy tanks, unlike what I said earlier in the LP, they are full heals. I guess I was conflating that with the other healing items in the game, period, which that's on me. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 6, we're going to go do areas 9 and 10 before heading off towards the final endgame area. See you guys then.